All right. Hello and welcome to this morning's panel. Thanks to everyone for tuning in and to Latin Trade for organizing it. We're going to be looking at the key political and social trends across Latin America this morning and how they're going to be shaping the year ahead. We're going to hit on the drivers of instability that predated the pandemic, the way the pandemic has sort of reshaped everything in terms of politics and economics, and whether and how that will all carry forward into the new year. So we have a fantastic panel to discuss all of that. Cynthia Arnson is director of the Latin America program at the Wilson Center. Irene is senior fellow for Latin America at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And Shannon O'Neill is vice president, deputy director of studies and senior fellow for Latin America studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Each of the panelists is going to start with a brief overview of how we got to where we are today, basically. And then we're going to throw it forward to 2021 in the Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions throughout using the Q&A function. And I'll try to incorporate them where I can into the discussion. So Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. And thanks to Latin Trade, and it's such a pleasure to be here with Cindy and Irene. So happy to join you all. When in Washington and the United States in general, there's a lot of excitement, I think, or at least among some, about what a new Biden administration means for Latin America, for U.S.-Latin America relations. Biden obviously knows the region very well because he was the chief emissary for Obama for many years. And I know we'll get to maybe what that means for the region, but what I'd like to start off with is just how much I think the region has changed since he was last in an official capacity looking at Latin America. And there's several elements I just want to touch on, and then we can have a bigger discussion if people are interested. So when I look at the region over the last 4 years, there have been a lot of changes, and a lot of them are not as hopeful as we all would want. So when we look at democracy, in many countries, it is really on the ropes. We look at Freedom House data, and each year over the last 4 years, there have been greater restrictions in many countries on opposition parties, on the electoral process, on freedom of the press, on organization of civil society. So we have seen a deterioration, many countries falling into the partially free category or going down the ranks, Venezuela and Nicaragua falling into the not free category over these 4 years. So I think there's a real challenge on the basic democratic governance for the region to deal with. The next issue, and I know my colleagues and Irene, I'm sure will chime in a lot on this side, is the economic side. Even before COVID, we saw stagnation in a lot of these countries. Some places have dealt with premature deindustrialization, so sort of losing the diversity in their economy, the kinds of jobs that provide a path up to the middle class. And I would say lots of these countries, to me, are not prepared for the future of work, for artificial intelligence, for automation, for the things that are happening in lots of other, not just developed economies, but other emerging economies that really haven't grappled with a lot of these issues. So that is a challenge going forward, and 4 years have gone by. A third issue that has changed a lot in these 4 years is migration. Yes, in 2014, 2015, we saw a big movement of Central Americans, but over the last 4 years, the big story of migration has been Venezuelans. In the last 4 years, 4 million Venezuelans have left their home, and the reasons they left their home have not gotten any better. So I wouldn't expect those numbers to change much. And at the same time, 1 million Central Americans left, and 500,000 Colombians have been internally displaced. So we see a lot of forced movement around that I think is one of the biggest challenges for the region, and has become, it has accelerated and become much more difficult because it's not just one place, it's many countries that are having this challenge. Both having people leaving, but then also receiving so many people who need help and support. And then the final thing I want to put on the table, which has changed over the last 4 years, and sorry to be a little bit pessimistic here to kick us off, but hopefully we can also talk about the good things that are happening. The final thing that has happened is when I look back when Biden was vice president, the sort of anti-corruption crusade that was happening around the hemisphere was in full force. We saw, prosecutors and judges in Curitiba in Brazil doing the Lava Jato investigations that took down high-ranking politicians and private sector leaders in Brazil, but also throughout the region. More than one president, went under given these investigations. We saw CICIG, the Guatemalan, UN-backed investigatory agency, bring down a president there and really work to strengthen the judicial system in in Guatemala. Honduras had their own OAS-funded investigatory agency that was got up and running. And now when I look in the region, a lot of these efforts have fizzled. Both CICIG and MASIC, which was the Honduran one, have shuttered their doors in the last couple of years, pushed out by their presidents. The Lava Jato investigation has run out of steam, and there's questions about the impartiality of some of the prosecutors and the like. And we've seen other big cases, for instance, in Argentina, the notebook scandal it's called, where the current vice president and many others allegedly sent a lot of bribes around for years, and there's detailed notations about who got them and when, really hasn't led anywhere. So I worry about there as the US comes back in and comes back in with a much broader agenda. Latin American countries, but also US in wanting to be involved, perhaps wanting to be involved. There's a lot of rebuilding to do just to get to where we were back in 2015, 2016.
Great. Well, as you mentioned, Irene, some thoughts on the economic side of things, so I'll turn it over to her next.
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, good morning from London. Lovely to be in an almost all-female panel. Doesn't happen very often, apart from Dave, of course. Yes, so I mean, I was planning to cover a little bit the macro picture where Latin America stands with respect to which I do think is going to be one of the drivers for political and stability trends for next year. So what we're seeing is that the region has been, as we know, one of the most affected by the pandemic. If we look at the forecast for this year and next year, we see that Latin America is going to be the country doing the worst in terms of economic performance, the region across the world. So we are, IMF is projecting a contraction of 8% this year, and then limited rebound next year to 2.6. If we compare to the rest of the emerging markets and developing economies, the contraction is 3.3 this year. So there is already, you can see the big difference. Also, what we are seeing is that basically it will take probably until 2023 for the region to go back to the same level of output it had before the pandemic. What we have seen is that basically the pandemic has really hit the Latin America for the same structural flows that Shannon was mentioning. So it's, as we know, is a region with a large number of informal workers. I think the average is around 50%, but then you have countries like Bolivia where it's 80% of the labor force, or Peru where it's 70% of the labor force. So it's a big informal market. You have a high level of inequality, which we see everywhere, and it's actually inequality of access to services, inequality we have seen with the pandemic of access to health services, but also difficulty really to access to the social security net, given that most of the population is in informal market. So this is obviously something that it was a precondition for being able to really mitigate the impact of the pandemic, and Latin America already was in a very dire situation before the pandemic, just because of what Shannon was mentioning. It was actually coming from a number of years of stagnation, I would say, from the end of the commodity booms in 2014. The economic structure of Latin America as well wasn't really very conducive to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Most of the countries we know either are dependent on commodities or remittances or services, including tourism. So I think that what we are seeing is that what we're probably going to see is that there is going to be an increase in unemployment and also in poverty, in inequality. There are very, very scary estimates when we look at different international organizations, something like 45 more million people in poverty if you look at the region overall this year. Also, I would say the pandemic has really left the region with very lasting fiscal scars. Already before the pandemic, the fiscal situation of the region was actually not so happy in some cases. Let's just remind ourselves that Argentina and Ecuador had defaulted last year. And there have been the debt is restructured, but nevertheless, it's not a region which already entered the pandemic in a very good fiscal position. So what we're seeing is that public debt was something like 60% of GDP last year for the region as overall. This is projected to increase to something like 74% of GDP this year. So a big escalation in public debt. It will of course, in a way, moderate next year, but nevertheless, it's really a heavy weight for the region to go forward and really to be able to not just reactivate the economy, but also think about a different way of development. Because what I think the pandemic has also shown is really that the model we were following until now is not something which is sustainable, because a model with high level of informality, high level of inequality is not something that actually create a resilient economy. So I think in the long term, what we see is that really there needs to be a rethinking of what the model needs to be. And I think there is the need for some structural reform, which are not easy in the current situation. In the short term, I think we will see that some of the economy in the region will rebound better, and it will depend really on, I would say, the capacity of the economic structure of the economy, first of all, so how much one depends from tourism or from commodities, but also the composition of the macroeconomic support measure, which most countries in the region have handed out quite generously, but also confidence in government, trust in government, and really the effectiveness of policies. And with that, I think I'll finish and let Cynthia speak.
Thanks so much. And yes, if you're hoping for something more optimistic, probably not yet, because Cindy's going to talk about political instability, I think, now. But over to you.
Right, Dave, thanks. Thanks to my co-panelists, to Latin Trade, for this wonderful invitation. I'm going to pile on. I'm going to continue the pile on, noting some of these underlying trends, certainly in the economy and in politics and support for democracy, and then talk about specific sort of detonators of social protest. You know, as Irene was saying, there are projected to be an additional 45 million people in poverty this year. That constitutes about over 37% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is, you know, against a decade in the 2000s of the golden decade of the commodity boom. And the poverty levels now are really setting things back over 2 decades, or at least 2 decades. And that is just stunning in terms of its implications. There's really no single answer to thinking about what the impact of this kind of economic moment means for the region. Political systems are very heterogeneous. You have high performers, you know, Uruguay, Costa Rica. You have Brazil under Bolsonaro, El Salvador under Bukele, Mexico under López Obrador, Chile in a historic process of constitutional reform. But I think it's likely that democracy overall is going to take a hit. Again, looking at some indicators before COVID-19. In 2018, which is the last report that Latino Barometro put out, the Chilean-based polling firm, it showed that support for democracy was less than half of the region's population. The Americas Barometer, LAPOP, based in the United States, has slightly better indicators, but still registers a precipitous decline. According to Latino Barometro, in 8 short years, between 2010, pretty much the end of the commodities boom, and 2018, support for democracy fell fully 13% throughout the region. There were also higher levels of indifference, especially among young people, another worrisome trend. In terms of people's satisfaction with the way democracy functions, this is not sort of, do I support democracy versus any other form of government, but am I satisfied with the way my government is functioning? According to LAPOP, which has generally more optimistic figures, the figure was less than 40% region-wide. And again, as Irene was mentioning, Shannon as well, this is against a backdrop even pre-COVID of stagnation, of low levels of economic growth, and therefore the failure or the inability of governments to deliver on the kinds of things that the emerging lower middle class, the middle class that had been created during these boom years, actually expected and wanted out of government. Things like quality services, education, primary among them. You look at a country like Chile, also in healthcare, the adequacy of pensions. A crucial issue in the Chilean protests. Clean and transparent government that delivers low levels of crime and violence, greater equality, all of these kinds of things were demands that were not met. So these three things, inequality, poor public services, and corruption, I think help explain in 2019, pre-pandemic, this explosion of social protest in major countries in the region. Certainly in Chile and Peru, those factors are very important. We're seeing it on the streets of Peru as we speak. And in a country like Colombia, you have the added issue of discontent and dissatisfaction with the way the peace accord is being implemented, reflected most graphically in this surge of violence and killing of human rights and social leaders in the countryside and areas that the peace accord was supposed to benefit. So what are the trends coming out of these? Shannon has already mentioned some of them. Increased authoritarianism, you see it in spades in a country like Venezuela that is about to hold National Assembly elections in a couple of weeks, in which the opposition simply is refusing to participate. You have the pressure on journalists, investigations, tax investigations of independent media outlets in countries like El Salvador, Bukele defying decisions of the Supreme Court, calling the armed forces into the legislature when the Congress doesn't vote the way that he wants. There are, unfortunately, as Irene was hinting, there are going to be increases in inequality in this historically unequal region. The gaps between formal workers and informal workers, between those who can afford to stay in a lockdown and those who can telework. I mean, the inability of people to stay in lockdown, I think, explains why Latin America continues to be the prime epicenter of the COVID pandemic. You have issues of corruption in Peru that have led to, 3 different presidents in the space of a week. And so this anti-incumbent sentiment that has grown not only in the region, but throughout the world, in the United States, I think is likely to increase. An increased appeal of populist leaders who say, we're gonna do things to lessen your economic pain, irrespective of the fiscal responsibility of those kinds of promises. And I'll end on a positive note, and then we can go into the discussion period. I think that the debate over the Chilean Constitution, which is one of the outgrowths, one of the major political reforms that's been underway, that was adopted in Chile in response to the protests, has the chance of really expanding democracy and expanding participation and people's buy-in into the political system. There are certainly pitfalls, and we can get into that. But there are ways, and I think we're also seeing it in Peru now, where this outpouring of public protest can lead to good things, can lead to demands for greater transparency, greater democratic participation and inclusion. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And there's a lot of threads to pull on from everything that all of you have said, but maybe just, you mentioned a few countries that are going to be going through elections or significant political events in the coming months, one of which is Peru. And I think Peru highlights so many of the things that we've talked about in terms of it's been hit as hard by the pandemic, both economically and in a public health terms, as any country in the world, really. I can't even keep track of who's president there at the moment. That is, and obviously they have another election coming up in April. we may have seen more presidents before then and protests in the street. I guess, can you go a little bit deeper on Peru and maybe what you expect in the coming weeks there, and maybe what that tells us about where the region is at the moment?
Sure. Well, I can jump in. I don't know if others want to add to this, but there was this movement within the Congress, which has very low credibility and itself had about half of its members under investigation for corruption or some form of irregularity, make repeated and ultimately a successful effort to impeach Martin Vizcarra, who has really, I think, led among regional leaders an effort to clean up corruption, to look into the Odebrecht scandal and see the tentacles and keep that going. So the removal of Vizcarra on this bizarre charge of moral vacancy or whatever, moral unfitness, caused people to just burst into the streets, especially when the politicians who were taking over, this member of Congress, Merino, was himself considered, highly corrupt. So young people, especially, and that's different, I think, in Peru than in the past, took to the streets. Merino lasted 5 days, and the new person who is now interim president, Sagasti, is seen as really the right person for the moment. He has sort of a lot of moral authority, is seen as legitimate, and his goal is to steer the country towards elections. Now, the difficulty in a country like Peru is that, there are very few, if any, really functioning political parties. Parties are created as vehicles around personalities, and we've seen this, since the 90s and the years of Alberto Fujimori. So it is still a system with a lot of volatility, with a lot of fragility, but you see this kind of social mobilization around issues of transparency that I think could end up being very salutary in terms of who emerges victorious in the April elections.
And Irene, over to you, I guess, in terms of either, if you want to build off of that, but just things that are on the political calendar coming up in 2021 that are on your radar and that you think will sort of highlight a number of the themes that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I agree with Cynthia in terms of positive trends of what we've seen in Peru. I think at the same time, we are about to embark in an election super cycle. So we have, even this year we still have Venezuela if it happens, but next year we're going to have election, as you mentioned, in Peru, in Chile, in Ecuador, in Honduras, in Nicaragua. Congressional election in Mexico, in Argentina, in 2022, again, big country, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica. So I think it's interesting because obviously all this frustration built up, which we have seen already before the pandemic, but which the pandemic is going to exacerbate, I guess, is going to be, I mean, in a way it's good when there's an election because it's actually let people actually channel this frustration into change, possibly. I guess the problem there is that sometimes what's going to happen is that there could be, again, choices more based on the principle of que se vayan todos, no? Like really thinking of putting some populist or somebody who's not, as we have seen, not just in Latin America, but across the world. But the other thing I think is also what Cynthia was mentioning to a certain extent in terms of political parties, right? Because I guess one of the things we've been seeing in the past few years in Latin America, but across the world, is really this kind of weakening of the traditional parties. So we're going to see more parties. I think some of those parties sometimes don't really have, they're not really parties, right? So it's going to become more difficult also for parliament to work in a way. Also, I think what we're going to see is the fact that the type of political debate is going to change. Obviously, the main thing would be now probably in the mind of all the voters more than before. What's the status of access to health services, for instance? What is really the status in terms of access to basic services? So I think this is something which was already part of the frustration before. Now it's going to become even more present. And I guess the government, and it's the incumbent, but also the government in general and the political party, what is the answer in a way? Because of course, as we have seen, the fiscal situation is much worse than before. So there is a limit to what one can actually grant. Or, you know, we see probably what's going to happen is that probably there's going to be a continuation of support of all the stimulus packages we have seen that they will have to continue, because there is no end to the pandemic. I don't think next year we're going really to see much changes. You know, there may be a vaccine, but then I guess the challenge of distributing the vaccine in an effective and swift way will be even worse than securing the vaccine, I think. So we continue to kind of fight with the pandemic, and this is going to be very present in the elections. But I guess really the question is also what is going to be the new model? Is it going to be more? Is it going to be like a drive towards privatization? Maybe not, because I guess the public will actually demand that the government maybe nationalize more things in order to be able to provide services. There's also the, I would say, international outlook, because in a way, you know, I think the only way really to create and to actually, in a way, address those claims and requests is really to ensure sustainable growth. But to ensure growth, you also need a demand, an external demand. And I think what we see probably next year and going forward, there's probably going to be, again, a drive toward protectionism in many countries. So, and with all the uncertainty also of obviously the US and China trade war and technological war, which I don't think is probably going to, I mean, Shannon will probably have a better view than me, but probably is still going to stay, I think. So I think there are going to be lots of different issues around this election. I think elections are good because, of course, we want people to be able to channel their discontent into some change. At the same time, wherever there are not elections, I think there is even a bigger risk for social unrest, right? Because there is no way actually to channel in an institutional way this kind of frustration. And that's in the sense, I think I agree with Cynthia. I think the constitutional referendum in Chile was actually a very nice way to, in a way, channel in an institutional way the frustration. I guess the question is whether this is going to be durable and whether the constitution is going to deliver what lots of people expect it to deliver. But I think it's an interesting way to try to channel in some fashion this kind of rightly so. I mean, this kind of demand from the civil society.
And obviously, we just had an election in this country. I'm sitting here in Washington. And actually, I should give a note that I saw that we have some new participants, so feel free to put questions in the Q&A function whenever you have them, and I'll try to integrate them into the discussion. But Shannon, turning to you for this one, obviously, we have a new president coming in January. There are a couple leaders in the region who have not acknowledged that reality yet, but what do you expect? You know, you mentioned basically the way the world has changed since Biden was last in the White House. Do you expect a lot of engagement out of the gate from Biden in the region? And what do you think will or should be on his agenda when it comes to Latin America?
Sure. Well, you know, as I was saying, he knows Latin America quite well, and he has a team around him that knows Latin America quite well. So I think in that sense, you know, we will see engagement. You know, I think the biggest shift we will see from the Trump years will be less about policy, though there are going to be some changes there, and I'm happy to talk about that, but will be about process. And so when we've looked at the last 4 years, Latin America policy in general, and particularly Mexico, US policy, Brazil, US policy, has been run out of the White House. It's been very personalistic. It's either been the president himself or his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. It has been at times quite punitive, even vitriolic between the two. And overall, it's been very transactional. You know, here's what's on the table, this is what I want, that's what you want. It has not been involving an interagency process. It has not, you know, the assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere has not been involved in these conversations. And often we haven't even had one, but even the people in position, right, that level has not really been involved in the day-to-day. They've not been delegated authority over lots of the types of issues. And so what that has meant is, to me, a much more narrow agenda, because one person or just a couple of people in the White House can't handle all of these issues and push them forward across the whole agenda. And it's also because it's the personal interests of the president, which have also been quite narrow vis-a-vis Latin America. So we have seen a big focus on migration, particularly migration from Central America coming up to the US southern border. We have at times seen the drug issues, particularly with Colombia wanting more eradication. So that's been really the main issue between those countries, despite a whole host of other things that the US and Colombia have worked on together historically. And so I think that is going to change. We're going to see in a Biden administration back to kind of old school Washington functioning. It's, the different departments and agencies are going to be brought in. You're going to have a return to experts and specialists and subsecretary levels working with their counterparts in those countries. So it will be more informed. It may be slower because, bureaucracies are plotting and you have to go through that process and you have to confer with your counterparts in other parts of the government. So, but overall, I think it ends up being stronger and also much, much broader. So that's, I think, the biggest shift is you're just going to have a lot more issues on the table where you're going to have day-to-day or week-to-week interactions with these various countries bilaterally. And then also, I think regionally, there's more interest. There will be more interest in multilateral institutions, in free trade agreements, and the kinds of things that really have fallen off the wayside over these last 4 years. I do also expect some real differences in the policy, and I'll just name a few. One of the biggest ones is going to be environment and climate change. The Biden campaign made that as a huge part of what's going to be national policy. I think it's going to be a very big platform in all foreign policy with any country that we're dealing with. So you're going to have different relations with the European Union, perhaps cooperation on these issues in terms of carbon taxes and the like. But with Latin America, you're going to see environmental policy, climate change be a big focus. And that, I think, could be quite welcome in some countries. And I think you could see initiatives that actually help some of these economic challenges. There's a lot of renewable possibility in the region, and you could see a lot of stimulus and economic growth from that. Obviously, it's going to be a little difficult with a couple of our partners in the region. So Brazil, the challenges of climate change in the Amazon, that's going to be front and center in the US-Brazil relationship. So there will have to be some discussions that probably be hard conversations. I think this could also be a bit of a tension in the US-Mexico relationship, because Mexico today is one of the only countries around the world that is actively trying to return their energy matrix to a fossil fuel-based and much dirtier energy matrix. I mean, even Saudi Arabia is turning to solar and other types of energies, while Mexico is going back to this very oil-based, heavy crude refining, fuel oil-based electricity grid. I mean, this is a very different path than almost any other country around the world. And so given the importance of climate change and environmental issues for the Biden administration, I think that will be a significant challenge. And then two other I'll put on, and then I'm sure my colleagues here have some ideas too, is I think labor issues will be a much more front and center issue, and in all relations, but particularly with Mexico, because the labor accord and the new USMCA, the new NAFTA, has yet to be defined, really how it's going to work. So I think we will see an administration and a Congress that really wants to define the workings of that particular mechanism. We're going to see that in the next couple of months. I think we'll see some activity. And then the final one I put on there is I do think the anti-corruption agenda is going to be back. I think it's going to be back around the world, but I think it's going to be back in Latin America. And I do think there are a lot of civil society partners and lawyers and other people in the region who want it to be back on the agenda. So for those who want to put that back on there and help the Vizcarras or help these other people deal with some of the challenges in their nations, I think you're going to find a willing and supportive United States under a Biden administration.
Great. And Cindy, I'll ask you the same question about what will or should be on Biden's agenda, but maybe adding in that last point about he's talked a lot about not promoting democracy, but the idea that democracy will be at the center of his foreign policy, right? He wants to deal with democracies. He wants to encourage good governance. Can that make a meaningful difference in the region? What do you expect the results of that for Latin America to be, I guess?
Sure. Well, I think it makes a huge difference that you have a country like the United States with all of the flaws that we have exhibited to the world, over these last months and years. it makes a big difference, and it encourages people in civil society that are fighting for those kinds of things, and gives support to politicians, within the political system, in the judicial system, that are trying to, move this agenda forward. What is going to be really complicated, I think, just take a case like Central America, where candidate Biden announced, a desire to have a large support package, aid package, to address the root causes of migration, not just to continue building border walls, but to go back to an effort that Biden had spearheaded as vice president in response to the 2014 initial crisis in the surge of unaccompanied minors, crossing the U.S. border, was to address, the drivers of migration in Central America. And if you are trying to do that at the same time that you don't have buy-in from the governments, as Shannon has mentioned, the Guatemalan government shut down the CICIG, and the Trump administration did not, raise a peep. In fact, in many ways, I think was probably quite happy to see that collapse. The MAXI, the Anti-Corruption Commission in Honduras, likewise, no longer exists. You have a president of Honduras whose brother has been indicted in the United States on drug trafficking, and there are all kinds of, questions swirling around his head. So it's not going to be easy. You have Nayib Bukele in El Salvador doing the kinds of anti-democratic, authoritarian things vis-a-vis, his legislature, his courts, the independent media. How is it going to work really when, when there's a desire to address root causes and the recipient governments are not necessarily, on your team? So I think that's going to be very, very challenging. Another area which I think will be different, at least initially at the margins, is Venezuela. The Trump administration policy has been laser focused on regime change via a strategy of maximum pressure through absolutely crippling sanctions that have really tried to turn off every single spigot, of oil income, have imposed secondary sanctions, made it very difficult for countries such as India, which has a large, petroleum relationship with Venezuela to operate. So the oil sector is really kind of on its knees. And there's really, no question that the economic situation in Venezuela, the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, that is the major push factor for this, flood of refugees, about 5 million people total that have left that country, since 2014, 2015, around a time of intense social protest and repression in Venezuela. Those refugee flows are going to increase, and there are estimates, that they're going to rise to 8 million, 10 million. Who really knows? And countries like Colombia, that have now, I think the official figure is about 1.8 million Venezuelans. It's probably higher than that at this point. It's probably closer, to 2 million. Peru. These are countries that are just, gasping for air under the, the weight of the pandemic and the economic hit. And Peru, probably one of the countries that is due to shrink, the most. There were just sort of apocalyptic estimates of 17%, GDP decline, more than double the rate for the rest of the region. So I think a Biden administration will look at sanctions policy and sort of say, is that really the only thing that we want to have going? So there may be an effort, to make humanitarian assistance, to create more possibilities for that, to provide more assistance to the countries that are receiving Venezuelan refugees. And we do have to be clear, the United States has been the largest contributor, but the UNHCR and the UN system, which is kind of overseeing all of this, says that it's received about 30%, of what the needs are to deal with this population. So there's a lot more that the United States can do. And I'll just end and say that I think in terms of Cuba, it is not going to be dialing the clock back to the sort of the warming days of the normalization, you know, of relations between the two countries. There may once again, you know, be an exchange of ambassadors. I would highly, I think highly likely is a removal of the restrictions on sending remittances to family members in Cuba. But the overall relationship is going to remain very tense. And one area of tension is precisely the role that that Cuba has been playing in Venezuela in providing, you know, military and intelligence support to help the Venezuelan regime, you know, root out any sources of opposition, you know, within the armed forces and absolutely squelch those. So those are some areas, I think, in addition.
Thanks. And I'm glad you mentioned Venezuela, because I think that Biden will come in right around the 2-year mark after the US recognized Juan Guaido. And obviously that situation seems stuck. But I guess, Irene, same general question. What are you watching for in terms of Biden's relationship with the region after taking office in January?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Shannon and Cynthia. I think obviously it's going to be a much more sympathetic and informed counterpart for the region, but I don't think there will be substantial changes also because, I mean, obviously there will be substantial changes in the sense that the debate is not going to be just dominated by migration, or rather bullying Central American and Mexican state to keep the migrant. Is going to be also about democracy, about climate change, and obviously labor law and all this very important freedom of the press, which actually has been, as we've heard, increasingly under attack in many countries, including Mexico. So I think probably to just say something positive, right? To end in a positive note. I think what would be an interesting opportunity for Latin America as well and for the US, it's really, you know, we have been hearing so much during the pandemic about this idea of the fact that essential supply chain needs to be regionalized, which is, you know, which makes perfect sense in some cases. And I think that's actually a real opportunity for Latin America, and also something that probably President Biden should focus on. It's really trying to use the supply chain links that already are there, you know, in Mexico, and through Mexico also through the Pacific Alliance and Pacific part of Latin America, to really try to sustain economic growth in the region through, I would say, really market-based mechanism. So I think that's an interesting way as well, where I think the two regions or the two sub-regions could actually go forward. That's actually one important thing. I think also the focus on, as Cynthia mentioned, of course, there is this focus on really helping with the root causes of migration in Central America. So I think that's an interesting development, and I think it's probably going to be really also quite at the center of the agenda, because it's also a domestic issue in the US. No? And whatever we are going to see now about the new Biden administration, really this focus again on domestic, on you know, factors or issues which actually have an important impact on labor and new jobs and economic growth in the US. So I think there is actually a good opportunity to, I wouldn't say find a solution, because it's very hard to, I mean, it's something that is not just about supporting growth in the region, but it's also, as Shannon was mentioning, there is an element in terms of drug policies and, you know, how do we do that I'm not sure is going to be really addressed or changed. But still, you know, I think it has to be welcome that there is again the issue of kind of promoting growth in Central America and Latin America in general is going to become again quite important for the US. So definitely that's a good news.
You know, can I just jump on that? I think this is actually really interesting, and just to support or sort of double down on what Irene was just saying about the supply chain issue. And as I look at the Biden campaigns, they have a whole platform on supply chains, right? And the supply chains, a lot of it is, you know, buy American or use the what's called the Defense Production Authority, the DPA, to provide contracts to make sure that strategic industries come back to the United States. Healthcare is one of them, but also there's a couple dozen commodities, rare earths, those kinds of things that they're talking about. But I do think there is space. There's two ways that I think Latin America can benefit from this. One is many of the free trade agreements the United States has with Latin American nations have government procurement as a place where other nations can come in and bid, and we can bid on contracts with their governments. So I think that's something that if I was a Latin American government, if I was a business association, if I was thinking about that, the economy ministries, when you see, which I think you will see in the United States, an expansion of government contracts into lots of these different types of industries for what will be deemed national security interests as well as economic interests. Are there places where your companies can insert themselves? Can you bid on these contracts? So I think that's something Latin American countries or companies often don't do, but I think there's a space there. And there'll be a growing space in the next couple of years. So I think that's something to think about within these sort of free trade agreements. And the other thing to think about is as we repatriate supply chains or reshore or nearshore, there's a lot of talk today about resilience and these sorts of things in supply chains, but you don't get resilience from geographic concentration. And we have seen that around the world, right? You saw Wuhan shut down because of Corona, and lots of car companies weren't getting the parts that they needed. We saw that in the United States when a hurricane hit Puerto Rico, and 4 months later, there were no saline bags in hospitals across the United States because they were all made in Puerto Rico. So I think there is an argument to be made policy-wise. You need diversification of geography, even if it doesn't mean global supply chains, if it means, nearshoring. And there, I think there's a case to be made by Latin American nations and to put themselves up. We can help you with that problem of geographic diversification. So yes, US policy will look out toward the region, but I think this is also a moment for the region and leaders in the region to think about how to approach the Biden administration to have their interests involved. And the last thing I will just say is when you look at some of the really big shifts in regional relations and particularly economic relations. And the one I'm thinking about most obvious is NAFTA, right? The first sort of free trade agreement with the region. That started in Mexico. That didn't start in Washington. So I think it is a place for Latin American governments to put things on the agenda of the United States they'd like to see. And I think they'll find a receptive government, at least to have a conversation about it.
Cindy, I saw you wave a hand. Go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, if I could just jump in. I mean, I think that as much as as Shannon was indicating, as much as the Biden platform talks about, bringing companies back from China, from Asia to the United States and creating jobs, in the United States, I think that there is a huge opportunity for countries that are on the periphery of the United States, the Caribbean and Central America, in addition to Mexico, to take advantage of this nearshoring, desire. And it could be, not just invest in America, but invest in the Americas. And I know that Colombia has also been trying to position itself to benefit from the desire of the Biden administration to bring companies, back. And the countries that have these existing free trade agreements with the United States, I think, are well positioned to do that, and probably have to, adapt some of their own reforms, and even including, building human capital and building logistics and transportation infrastructure to really be able to take advantage of this. But you also have, a development finance corporation, which is the kind of the successor organization from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation from OPIC, that could play a significant role in stimulating US private sector investment in ways that really make it possible for countries to take advantage of this nearshoring.
And before we zoom all the way off of of Biden's relationship with the region, Shannon, I just want to ask quickly about the U.S.-Mexico relationship specifically, because I know we've gotten off to a slightly awkward start where López Obrador has not recognized Biden's victory. They probably would have spoken by now because he called Trudeau the first day when he began the calls, but they haven't spoken yet. I guess, how are you expecting not just the two of them, but the two administrations to interact?
Right, we've gotten off to no start yet, right? Because there hasn't quite recognized and probably won't recognize the government until, perhaps even until January 6th, which would be the official day that legally, the new Congress recognizes Biden as the president-elect. I think this is going to be, it'll be both a more fruitful relationship, I think, between the two countries and a more difficult one, frankly, because what we've seen over the last 4 years is, yes, we've seen some angry tweets and some punitive measures and the like from the Trump administration, but basically what Trump cared about was stopping migrants. And as long as López Obrador stopped migrants coming up or took them back when they did get there, most of the other things that were happening in Mexico were not of interest to the Trump administration. I think that's going to be very different in a Biden administration, right? You're going to see a Biden administration that cares about the environment, that cares about labor issues, that cares about human rights, that cares about democratic governance, that cares about free and fair elections, that cares about civil society movements, that cares about the freedom of the press, that cares about all of these, the much richer relationship than we've seen, and we'll have all the different agencies and departments staffed to look at those issues. Now, I think many of those issues, López Obrador is perfectly fine not to have any outside interference or outside interest. This is a president who notoriously is very internally focused, does not have a lot of fascination, much less even interest in the rest of the world, right? The only trip he's made outside of the country in 2 years was to go up and meet with Trump and last July and be part of a campaign photo op, it seemed. So I think we're going to see some rocky moments within the relationship, but in the end, I think that broader and deeper relationship will actually be better for both countries in all of the challenges but potential opportunities that we face together.
Turning back to the pandemic, Irene, you mentioned the sort of outlook for economic recovery is relatively grim, actually. I was just reading an IMF report that said most countries will not get back to pre-pandemic GDP until 2023 and real income per capita until 2025. So we're talking about a prolonged economic recovery across the region. I guess I know it varies substantially country to country, but can you talk a bit about the challenges that governments are facing in trying to keep whatever stimulus they've been able to pass alive, especially if the recovery really does take years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a very challenging situation because, in a way, as I mentioned, the fiscal position has worsened significantly across the region. There are some countries which are in a better position. Chile, Peru definitely entered the pandemic in a better state. But I think in general there will need to be some kind of putting the macroeconomic situation in a more sustainable path. At the same time, I think there is really the opportunity, and I think that the good thing in the pandemic is now there is the need really to look at how do we ensure sustainable growth? Because in a way, we have seen that the growth in Latin America has always disappointed. Well, it's been a bit more sustained during the commodity boom, but just because, again, of external factors, right? So in a way, the region hasn't really capitalized in those years to do the important structural reforms that need to be done. The result is that we're still dealing with a situation of high informality, inequality, and I think really there is, even if it's not easy, there is a need to really rethink the development model, and really, apart from structural reform that we are always been people working in Latin America. I mean, I have worked on Latin American competitiveness for many years, and it's always the same every year. We always recommend obviously you need to look at your labor market, liberalize your factor markets, invest in training. You need to actually look at the fiscal, at the tax system, and all those kind of structural reforms, which in a way we saw some of it happening a little bit. Mexico was under Peña Nieto, we were all very enthusiastic the first 2 years, and then unfortunately other problems went in the way. So I guess there is really, Latin America is in a position where now needs to do all those reforms in a much worse situation. But also, I think there is the opportunity really to look at, is there a new model that could be followed? Is there a new model that actually puts inclusivity at the core of it, not because it's good, but because it's good for, for the common good, but because it's actually fundamental for building resilience and for building competitive economies. So I think there is that. There is obviously what Shannon was mentioning around the green growth. So really the opportunity around sustainable growth and sustainability, which the region has plenty of renewable energy, and there are opportunities there. There are things that I think we can, Latin America as the rest of the world, in terms of, really leveraging better new technology, digitalization. We have seen during the pandemic, we all have become quite used to work from home and use the digital tool also for providing and for benefiting of services, of basic services. So I think, is there an opportunity there to use that also to help the region leapfrog to a better situation? But I think fundamentally, what this pandemic has really highlighted once more is that we need a new model, we need a new growth model, and we need some more fresh thinking about that. And I think in the short term, as I said, some countries will do better than others. I think it will much depend also on the structure of the economy. As I said, obviously, countries which are just based on commodities, we'll do a bit better because commodity will improve. The price of commodity will go a bit up next year, but nevertheless, it's never something forever, right? It's just depending on what. And I think the problem with Latin America is that in a way, there is a need really to stop being actually victim of what is happening around the world, right? In a way, it is always a very passive way to grow. In a way, if we grow if there is high demand of commodities or whether the prices are going up. So I think it's very important, and it's probably not very original to say, but I think it is important to really look at the drivers of growth and try to reinforce that. And really, corruption and governance is something that is also very much at the core of that, because if you don't have government effectiveness, but also in the private sector, it's really, it's very hard to do reform and also to implement reform in an effective way. So I think it's really back to basics for Latin America, and I hope it's going to be the opportunity to do that. And I think also the fact that Latin America is now in more multipolar order in a way. It's not just the US, it's also China. So there is an opportunity, I think, also for Latin America to kind of use the two, one against the other to a certain extent, and really find an increased clout in terms of geopolitical clout, which at the moment, Latin America, nobody really talking about Latin America. I was reading an article, I think it was on Foreign Affairs, saying Latin America is really not sitting at the table. At least it's not on the menu, but it's not sitting on the table either. So I think that is where we need to take this pandemic as a way to really have a serious conversation and really thinking about what would be the best way to ensure that we become actually, the Latin America really becomes master of itself and really put the foundation for sustainable growth.
Dave, if I could I just add to that, because I think I think it was you, I can't remember who, was talking about this kind of super cycle of elections that the region is facing, next year and in 2022, where, all of the major countries except for, I think, Argentina will be holding, general elections for president, assembly, whatever. And all I want to point out is that the sort of disjuncture between political time and economic time. I mean, if you're talking to somebody in 2020, they don't have 5 years for their real income to get back to what it was, prior to the pandemic, which already, had been leading to these protests. So I feel that it's very sobering to look at the way, this level of economic pain, has been, just so pervasive in the region, to see, how that's going to be channeled politically, and who in an irresponsible way is going to take advantage of that. And people are going to say, I'm going with that person because that person says that he or she is going to spend on me and not on something else. And so, I feel fairly pessimistic that what Irene is quite rightly, mentioning as a rethinking of the development model and, making Latin American economies more sustainable and resilient. I'm just not sure that this will be the political moment for that to happen.
Well, I'm going to flip it around on you. Since this is our last minute, we can go around quickly. And we said we'd get the pessimism out of the way at the beginning. So maybe if you could each, starting with you, Cindy, is there anything looking into 2021 that you're feeling optimistic about for Latin America? Oh, sorry, you're still muted.
Sorry, I remuted myself. I'm optimistic about the process in Chile. I think that it is a great example about how this, outpouring of millions of people on the street can be channeled, through the political system to create, kind of really deep reform. There's certainly the danger that expectations will exceed the capacity of the system to deliver, but I think that that's a very positive process. I think what's going on in Peru right now is very positive, and if young people who traditionally have not participated in elections can channel that in favor of, democratic reform, I think that that's very positive. So I also think that there's a lot going on at the level of municipal government, regional government that gets lost when we look just at what's happening in national politics. That's also, very encouraging.
Irene, do you have anything that you're feeling optimistic about?
Yeah, I mean, I would second what Cynthia said. I think it has also been quite nice to see, election in Bolivia actually going quite smoothly. Everybody was expecting like the worst, but they went quite well. I think there is a lot of positive energy in the civil society, which needs to be channeled, and I think that's going to be the challenge. But definitely, it's something good to see in Chile, in Peru, across the region. I think there are opportunities as well, as I said, and I agree with Cynthia. I mean, I am quite pessimistic on Axios' structural changes to the economy, but I do think there is an opportunity, there is a momentum for that. So I think there is really a need and an opportunity to think about that. And there is lots of, in the civil society, within international organizations. So I think it's probably good. If that's a good moment, is actually now. I don't think we will have a better moment than now, just because of the dire situation in which the economies are. So yeah, I mean, I'll be looking forward to see the election and see how it all pan out. But if we follow the Bolivia and Chile model, then there are reasons for optimism, I think.
All right, and Shannon, you get the last word. What are you feeling optimistic about?
Well, I'll say, right now is an anti-incumbent moment, and there's lots of risks with that. There's worries about populism and destruction of political parties and the like, but there's also opportunity there. And let's face it, some of the people leading these countries, or the political parties leading these countries, aren't the best representatives of democracy and inclusion. So perhaps moving some of them out for others who might have fresher ideas, some of the things we've talked about, bringing in the youth vote and the like, that could be a good thing. So it's not always a bad thing to get rid of incumbents, right? Or to have an anti-incumbent moment. And then the second thing, I want to just go back to Cindy's point about economic time versus political time. And I will say one perhaps bright spot is over the last 10 plus years, there are a lot of Latin American countries have put in the hard work to do painstaking judicial reforms, education reforms, some of these reforms, structural reforms that Irene was talking about, and they just take a long time to come to fruition. So we've seen some benefits on the corruption side because of judicial reforms that have happened, whistleblower acts and other kinds of things. And I think we'll see some of the education changes. It's not enough, of course, but some of the education changes, the next generation will have had a different experience than their parents did or their grandparents. And so those are things I think we can be somewhat optimistic about.
All right, well, thank you so much to all three of the panelists and to Latin Trade for putting this together, and also to all of you for tuning in. I think this was a great discussion, so thanks everyone.